Good morning. It's Monday the 19th of October and it's time for DaviePHD's MythBusters episode 13. Many things are said about Scotland, independence, the Union, the EU, etc. In these videos I bust the myths that many people believe and are commonly peddled by those opposed to independence. This week I'm busting the old, tired and very wrong myth that Scotland is too wee and too poor to manage on its own. We've been fed a negative narrative on Scotland's economy for a long time. A depressing picture drawn by Westminster politicians, portraying us as a subsidised state dependent on the UK for charitable handouts to meet the very basic needs and wants of our people. There's just one problem with that narrative. It's absolute bollocks. In fact, this narrative is so manifestly untrue that all the available economic data entirely contradicts the age-old, absurd and tired Westminster proposition that Scotland could not exceed as an independent self-governing country. In the olden days before the internet and the Freedom of Information Act, it was easy to hoodwink us. But since the information became widely, publicly and readily available, the too small, too poor and too stupid argument has become so completely discredited that none of the major players in the 2014 Better Together campaign even dared to suggest it. So, some figures. Individuals and businesses in Scotland raised £62 billion in taxation in the year 2018-19. We received £32 billion back as our block grant to fund government expenditure in Scotland. Now the Scottish Government has to return a fully counted and balanced budget. Every penny has to be accounted for. The UK Government claims to spend £75 billion in or for the benefit of Scotland, including the block grant. And they say this equals a subsidy or deficit of £13 billion, ergo the charitable handout. But they don't have to be quite as transparent with their spending as we do. Here are some examples of how that figure deceives us into thinking we are poor. £4.5 billion of it is public service debt interest. This is apparently our share of interest on debts accrued by the United Kingdom. This is despite Scotland having no borrowing powers and the government providing no accountability to Scotland on how this money is borrowed and what it's spent on and whether or not it was spent in or for the benefit of Scotland. Pooling and sharing. As an example, Scotland makes way more electricity than it requires for its own needs. At the moment, any surplus is absorbed by the national grid and other distribution networks around the rest of the UK as part of our pooling and sharing of resources. We don't get paid for this as we're all one happy family of nations, so why would we charge each other? In electricity alone, we generate a 50% surplus in electricity per capita, which gets absorbed by being connected to the national grid. As our Scottish renewable sources increase, this continues to rise. At the moment, we provide about 5% of our UK's electricity needs for free. The same is true for Scottish water, but to a much larger extent than for electricity. Oil and gas revenues continue to be attributed to Crown Estates, and therefore the UK exchequer rather than Scotland. They never have been attributed to Scotland, and they really should be. Defence spending. Our share of the UK's £42.2 billion defence budget is for the military of a nation obsessed with being one of the big boys and throwing its weight around the world, projecting its power. Our per capita share of that total is £3.5 billion. Trident alone costs the UK £20 billion a year, and our share of that should be £1.68 billion based on a per capita sum. Our UK large projects like HS2. HS2 alone currently estimated cost of £110 billion over 10 years. And this has gone up from the £80 billion it was quoted less than a year ago, and it's likely to rise again. But assuming the UK government pays £11 billion a year per capita for 10 years, our share would be £900 million a year. English headquartered companies. Let's take Tesco. the UK's largest supermarket chain. Now, they don't make as much money as you might think. Their margins are very tight indeed. £52 billion in revenue has to pass through Tesco's tills so that they can make a profit of £1.5 billion as they did last year. Now, firstly, if they got taxed on their profits at an exact 20% corporate rate, there would be £300 million for the UK exchequer. But more important is the revenue that each supplier will be paying taxes as they supply Tesco with goods. So to run £52 billion through Tesco, doing a simplistic calculation, let's say for example half of that revenue was taxable and it was taxed at 20% corporate rate, you're looking at £5.2 billion in taxes just through the Tesco supply chain. And using those figures, Tesco alone should generate £5.5 billion in taxes for the exchequer, even if it pays much, much less than that itself. The reason I say should is because they get tax breaks and relief for things. Now, the Scottish contribution should be £700 million, but as the company is registered in England, it is counted as English, so it's zero, nada, zilch for Scotland. Now, think about all the other large retailers, fast food chains in your area who are registered in England. Think back to the expenses you pay every month. Fuel, electricity, gas, mobile phones, internet, mortgages, loans, credit cards, all most likely paid to companies registered in England. All your locally earned and spent pounds are going into the coffers of English-owned companies, and they in turn are paying taxes on the English side of the balance sheet, making Scotland look poorer. English import and export taxes is the next one. Import and export duties are levied at the port of departure and do not reflect the geographic origin of a product. A local success story we can all be proud of in the North East is Brewdog Beer. Started in Fraserburgh and now headquartered in Ellen, and they're all over the world now. But its main international distribution hub is in England. Any Brewdog product exported from the UK leaves from an English port of departure. So taxes raised by a Scottish company exporting a Scottish product are recorded as English export duty. It's pretty much the same with UK import duties. They're charged at the port of entry, which is rarely Scottish. And we move on to big digital. Well, this is where things get a bit murky. As an example, Google claims that its UK arm had £1.6 billion in revenue passed through it last year, and it paid just £44 million in UK corporation taxes. Now, Google doesn't actually have any products. They're basically a big advertising agency with a search engine tacked on the side. But a company with a revenue of £1.6 billion has a wage and salary bill of £1.04 billion is clearly doing some creative accounting. Added to which, independent researchers have unofficially estimated that £5.6 billion passed through the UK arm of the firm in ad sales. If the researchers are correct, then even with that staggering wage bill, Google should have cleared £4 billion in profit and paid something in the region of £800 million to the UK exchequer, with a Scottish per capita share of £67 million. Factor in Facebook, Amazon, Instagram, TikTok and every other large digital company operating, and you can see that we're being mugged off. Buckingham Palace. £350 million is soon to be spent on Buckingham Palace. Yes, we are paying for a house renovation for a lady who can afford a gold-plated piano. Our per capita share would be £29.4 million. That's undoubtedly claimed to be for the benefit of Scotland, as she's our queen too. The Westminster renovation is going to cost £2 billion. The Houses of Parliament, they're ancient, they're crumbling. A £2 billion renovation programme's underway. Our per capita share of that being £168 million. Even though very little benefit for Scotland seems to be coming out of the wretched place these days. Now, if we were to stay with the UK, then there's no real problem with any of this. But when it gets distorted to make us look poorer than we really are, then there's a problem. And it's a pretty big one. Let's tackle them one at a time. £4.5 billion is public service debt interest, by far the biggest chunk of the £13.5 billion Scottish deficit the UK government apply to us. But the UK government haven't made any progress in paying the capital of their national debt. They've just been paying the interest. It's kind of like those old endowment mortgages where people just used to pay the interest and then lose their house at the end of the term. Now, believe this or not, but under international law, an independent Scotland would be under no obligation to keep paying our share until the UK government started to pay off the actual capital of their debt. If they just keep servicing the interest, we'd be under no obligation to continue to contribute. The pooling and sharing. Our UK needs the water, oil, gas and electricity that we have an abundance of. So pooling and sharing would soon become selling and buying, which is as it should be. An example based on electricity, we currently have 2 million households, 500,000 businesses supplied with electricity in Scotland. As we generate more half again, and that is absorbed into the national grid, you could say we're also supplying 1 million households and 250,000 businesses in our UK with Scottish electricity. Assuming that each have a bill of £1,000, collectively that's £3.75 billion. Given that we're heading towards 100% renewable, all of that will soon be free electricity with a corporation tax soon be leviable at £0.75 billion. Not bad. Defence spending. Our per capita share of UK defence spending is £3.5 billion. As we would also get rid of Trident, that per capita 1.68 billion share likely reducing our spending to about 1.8 billion at a stroke. With a shift of focus more from the UK's projection of its power onto internal security and humanitarian programmes, I'm pretty sure we could reduce our military spending even further and still maintain our security and international obligations. Our UK projects like HS2, quite simple really. Once we're no longer part of the UK, then we no longer need to contribute. They could also pay for their own parliamentary and palace renovations. English headquartered companies, well, they'd have 3 choices. Number 1, don't operate in Scotland. 2, pay higher taxes to operate as a foreign company in Scotland. Number 3, open a Scottish subsidiary, operate and pay normal taxes in Scotland. Now the wisest and cheapest move is to open a Scots subsidiary. The big example, Tesco, know this with their venture into Thailand and other Asian countries. I'm going to conservatively estimate that would bring an extra £10 billion to the Scottish Exchequer. Now this puts us at a surplus of £4.95 billion. Deficit's gone. And we're not even finished yet. English import and export taxes. Well, Scotland would need to develop capacity to import and export goods directly to and from Scotland. Duties for them would then come directly to the Scottish Exchequer. Now last year the UK raised £3.32 billion in import-export duties. A Scottish share would have been £360 million. So that's in our balance too. Now big digital. It's well known that big digital businesses have been taken to piss ref taxes paid and that the UK government have been weak in collecting it. Ensuring that they pay a fair share, funnily enough, like they have to in most European countries, will go a long way to redressing the balance. The UK have failed to get a grip on these guys. Scotland alone should have had £67 million out of Google. With a fair tax system and them having to base here, I would estimate another £300 million for our exchequer for the big digital sector. None of this considers the increase in GDP from companies having to relocate here. None of it considers the possibility that EU companies will want to move here once we are back in. The oil and gas revenues haven't even been factored in yet, nor are the charges for water we'd have to send down to our UK. And none of it considers the biggest independence bonus of all. The UK has £10.13 trillion in assets. 1.3 trillion of those assets are Scottish. So with 8.4% of the UK population, we have 12.8% of UK assets. All of these factors are enough to see off any of that Westminster attributed deficit on day one of independence, without even mentioning the potentially massive increase in GDP and tax take when English companies have to set up in an independent Scotland. Scotland has already been financially punching above its weight within the UK for a long time. Independence is the only way to have that acknowledged, and to gain the powers to spend that money to benefit ourselves. With all of our taxes staying in Scotland, reduced spending in some key non-devolved areas, the return of our assets from our UK, we could have all the tools necessary to hit the ground running as a fully financially independent country on day one of independence. A few years ago, the former UK Chancellor, Denis Healey, in an exclusive interview with Holyrood magazine said, "Scotland pays its fair share, and that these myths are simply perpetuated by those opposed to Scottish independence, and that Scotland's oil wealth had been squandered by Westminster rather than invested, while being underplayed in value terms by the UK government to subdue calls for Scottish independence." Guys, there's a couple of reasons that the UK have wanted to keep us in the dark about how rich we really are as a country. It's the same reason they kept the Macron report, the one that said Indie Scotland could have had an embarrassment of riches, quiet for 30 years. Number one is that they know darned well that we can manage just fine without them. And number two, they also know darned well that they'll feel the pain of our departure the hardest. Folks, thanks for watching. Please feel free to share this video with anyone you like, especially undecided voters whose biggest concerns about Indie are financial. DaviePHD.